Okay.
Okay, we are about to start streaming. I think we are streaming. Yes? You guys are on? Okay, perfect. So,
Okay.
take it away.
So hello. Today we're here with Neil Balchan, and he's going to be talking about snakes. And my name's Karina, and I'm a senior.
And I'm Penny and I'm a junior. And take it away.
Sorry, I should turn my audio on. All right, thanks guys. Thanks so much for that intro. Give me just a moment here. I'm gonna try to figure out screen share one more time. All right, I think we're screen sharing. Is everybody seeing a slideshow, hopefully? Yeah, perfect. All right, so the way I'm gonna kind of run this today is I'm gonna kind of just talk at you for about 20 minutes, 15, 20 minutes. I'm gonna share a little bit about, what I do, who I am, what my research is. And then I actually brought a snake friend with me today. So we can do a little bit of show and tell at the end, and that can be kind of an informal, just question and answer period. If you have any questions about my work or about snakes or about, life in the sciences even. So anything like that. So I guess without any further ado, I'll just go ahead and get into it. I guess it's 1 o'clock here. So hi again, guys. So I know I just got a great little introduction there, but my name is Neil Balchan. I'm a PhD student at Oklahoma State University here in Oklahoma, which is quite cold right now, unfortunately. And I'm kind of just a snake nerd, I guess, is a really good way that I would describe myself. So I grew up in Canada, in central Canada, in a place called Winnipeg, where it was very cold, where we didn't have a lot of snakes. But I managed to kind of eke out a little existence doing snake work, and I, worked on the very few snakes that we had. And that career trajectory kind of pushed me to move around a lot. So I then moved to Colorado, which is where a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about today really occurred. And I'm now in Oklahoma, where I'm working on a couple of different things. So I'll go ahead and just dig into this. So today we're going to really talk about this idea of biochemical ecology of this snake called the prairie rattlesnake. And when we're talking about biochemical ecology, we're generally talking about venoms. All right. So what is biochemical ecology? Now you guys all have a pretty strong science background, but I'll just go ahead and try to break this down and make it a little bit more simple. So biochemical ecology are these ecological interactions, right? So we think about predation often. That's a really common one. So something eating something else, right? Now this is different from regular predation because these interactions are actually chemically mediated. So they're controlled by chemicals, right? And one really important chemical in our system here is venom, right? So if we think about these biochemical ecological interactions, we can think about a bird and a monarch butterfly, right? So our bird, let's say a happy little house sparrow, he flies around in our backyard, he eats seeds and bugs and things like that. And you might see this really pretty monarch butterfly. Now, this monarch butterfly is bright orange, and it's what we would call chemically defended, right? So it has chemicals or toxins floating around in its system. It's going to taste really bad. And when that butterfly goes ahead, or when that bird goes ahead and it attacks that butterfly, it might actually get something along the lines of a stomach ache, or it'll at least have a very distasteful reaction to that butterfly. And as a result, that chemical protection actually protects that butterfly from bird predation. So we can think about it that way, right? Now, when we think about snake venoms, these venoms represent a really tight linkage between what we call the genotype, so the genetic makeup of that animal, and the animal's environment, right? So everything around it. Because these toxins in the venom are under the influence of very strong selection from all these things in the natural world, right? So a hawk might want to eat a snake, maybe a coyote or a dog wants to eat a snake, and that venom actually has to fit for all of those different roles potentially, right? So biochemical ecology. I know that's complicated. Don't worry too much about it, but that's kind of the idea that we're running with here. So with that, what are the main goals of the work that I'm telling you about today? So I have two big goals, right? Kind of under this biochemical ecology framework. And I want to understand how this works with our prairie rattlesnake. And I have two kind of topics that I delve into here, right? So I want to look at geographic venom variation. So how do these venoms actually change across the landscape in this one type of rattlesnake? And then predator-prey interactions. So how do these venoms impact how our snake, is predated upon by other things or how it eats things of its own, right? So rodents, for example. All right. So what is a venom, right? So venoms are complicated. And I guess if we break it down, venoms are a complex mixture that contains things like proteins, peptides, enzymes, and they do a bunch of different things, right? So one potential function of venom is digestion. We see, varying evidence for this, but the idea is a snake bites something, it gets a whole lot of venom flowing through the system of that animal, and that's actually going to digest that animal from the inside out. So digestion. Another idea is defense, right? So if I'm a snake and I'm slithering around and let's say a dog comes up and tries to attack me, I can actually bite that dog or I can spray venom at that dog if I'm a spitting cobra, and that might kind of ward off that attacker, right? So venom has a really defensive functionality. But the most important thing that's really controlling this venom is this idea of prey acquisition, right? So I, as a snake, need to feed myself. And if I'm eating a frog versus a mouse versus a sparrow, the venom that I need to have might actually change, right? That might be very different from one prey item to another. And because of that, we see that diet and prey acquisition is actually a really important driver of what compounds are inside of a venom to begin with. So keep this in mind. And then one more kind of wrench, just to throw in the whole situation, is that these snake venoms can actually vary dramatically, and they can even vary within a single species, right? So if we look at just this example, we have a Mojave rattlesnake, and what we see is that over the range of this animal, so from, let's say, Nevada all the way down to maybe central Mexico, we see different venom types, right? We see a type A, we see a type AB, and so on and so on. So even in one type of snake, we can have different types of venoms. So this is a really, really complex situation, and there's really a lot here to dig into and study as a scientist. All right, so introducing my animal. So I've been working on the prairie rattlesnake to try to understand these themes. And the prairie rattlesnake is kind of a medium-sized rattlesnake. It lives all across the central US. We get it in southern Canada, and it ranges all the way into northern Mexico. And this is a grassland rattlesnake. So think of your classic kind of maybe a cow pasture in Colorado or Kansas. That's the type of habitat that you'll find this rattlesnake in. Now we know that it's venomous. In fact, it is, a dangerous snake. But those spatial elements of how that venom can vary are actually really poorly understood. So a little bit of early work was done, and what that told us is that venoms are typically going to be what we would call lytic in nature. So they're rich in these enzymes, in these proteases. So when you get bitten by a venom like that, you'll see a lot of kind of tissue degradation, a lot of bleeding, really just breakdown of muscle tissue, right? But in some other populations, we've identified something called a myotoxin. Now, a myotoxin is a very powerful kind of a paralytic compound. And what that does is that causes muscles to stiffen up, right? So you can think about one venom being a little bit more degradative in the sense that it might turn something into mush, whereas the other venom will paralyze stuff and kill it really, really quickly. So these are the two extremes that we could potentially see. But we don't know where those venoms are. So that's a pretty important thing to figure out. So that's exactly what we wanted to figure out. Now, this work was led largely by a PhD student that I worked with at the time, but there were a bunch of people that really contributed to this. And, whenever you have a bunch of people, you have a bunch of stuff going on. So we really tackled this from multiple angles. So we did a whole lot of field work, and this is definitely my favorite part. So we went all over this green part of the map here, and we looked for prairie rattlesnakes. And these dots all represent prairie rattlesnakes, so we did find quite a few. We went ahead and did a bunch of lab work. So some of that was venom proteomics. So just looking at that venom in a lab setting, we played with different enzymes. We looked at lethal activities, and we also had some genetic data. So none of this really matters in the big picture, but the point that I'm just trying to drive home is that sometimes it takes a really big team to understand what's going on. All right, and here's what we see. So I'm just going straight into data. So we actually find a pretty strong divide in these two venom phenotypes. So I talked about that myotoxin, right? That paralytic venom. Well, we see in the northern part of the range, we have a lot of this myotoxin. So we have a very paralytic venom. So snakes in the north, if they bite you, bam, you're going to get paralysis, and it'll potentially be a very toxic snake bite. But in the south, we see the opposite trend, right? And we see this component called SVMP. You can just remember that acronym for now. But this stands for something called snake venom metalloprotease or metalloproteinase. And this is that toxin that I talked about earlier that will essentially turn you into mush, right? So it'll degrade your muscle tissue. It'll cause a lot of bleeding. So we have two types of venom. We have a northern kind of kill you quick toxic venom, and we have a southern turn you into mush and kill you more slowly venom, right? So I'm oversimplifying it, but these are the two extremes that we're seeing in our prairie rattlesnake. Now, what we also see, which is exceptionally interesting, is that these different types of venom have a really strong relationship with latitude. So as we move northward, we actually get an increase of that paralytic compound, right? So snakes are becoming more toxic and more paralytic as we move north in the United States, but we see the opposite too, right? So as we move south, they're becoming more degradative. So more of a kind of turn you into mush type of venom. So these two venoms kind of run on an axis, right? And if we move north, we go more of one way. If we move south, we go more of another way. So those are a lot of words, right? So what does that actually look like? Well, if we plot that on the landscape, this is what we see, right? Now, these are the same maps twice. They're the same individuals just thrown on maps with different colors. And blue is a more toxic venom, right? A more paralytic venom. So we have the blue stuff on the right. Red stuff is a more degradative venom, so a more turn you into mush venom. And we have that on the left. And what we see is this really, really interesting flip-flop dynamic, right? So snakes in the north are strongly blue. They're very paralytic, but they're weakly red. So they only lightly turn you into mush. But if we flip that, right, and we look in the south, snakes are very, very red and not very blue. So there's a really strong trade-off right around Denver where we see these venom phenotypes switch. So this is really interesting. There doesn't appear to be any middle ground where snakes are maybe doing a little bit of both, or they're kind of medium as far as that venom goes, right? All right. So with all of that in mind, we see these two major kind of different venom compositions that are partitioned on the landscape. So one question we might ask with that is, does phylogeny matter? Or if we simplify that, do genetics matter, right? Does it matter how related you are to the next snake, let's say down the block there? Well, when we go ahead and look at that, we see that these venoms do generally track relatedness, right? So you're quite likely to have a similar venom to somebody you're more related to, but we actually see weak population structure associated with each type of venom. So what that means is that if we're in an area where snakes can breed with each other and they have different venoms, they still maintain their venom types that they have, right? So even in the face of really strong kind of genetic mixing, we could say, those venoms are upheld. So really interesting stuff there. So we know that genetics matter a little bit. So what else might actually drive venom? Well, something that I really fixate on a lot is what snakes eat, right? So how does prey play into this? How do different prey items maybe impact what we're seeing in terms of venom composition? Well, we know that prairie rattlesnakes are what we call a generalist predator, right? They kind of eat everything. They're like the Pac-Man of the snake world. And if you live in a cow pasture somewhere on the Great Plains, you might be bumping into things like rodents. So maybe house mice, maybe rats, a whole suite of native rodents. There's probably a ton of birds. So things like meadowlarks, different sparrows. And then you also have lizards running around everywhere, right? So these are going to need different venoms to take down easily or effectively. So what we did is myself and then the PhD student I was referencing earlier, Kara Smith, we went ahead and we cut open a bunch of dead prairie rattlesnakes. And these are rattlesnakes of museums. We did not kill any rattlesnakes for this work, but we went ahead and cut them open and we tried to look at what they were eating. And here's what we find. So really, really interesting stuff. I'm going to break it down a little bit slowly here because I know these pie charts don't really tell much of the story, but those little abbreviations just stand for different states, right? And those colors correspond with different types of prey items. So if we look at MT, which is Montana, right? So about as far north as you're going to get in prairie rattlesnake distribution, it is all dark blue. In Montana, our snakes are only eating mammals, right? They're only eating mice and kangaroo rats and things like that. So they only really need a venom for mammals if we think about that, right? If we go a little bit more south in Colorado, these guys are again really only eating mammals, right? We do see a bird or two kind of get into there. Who's to say the Montana snakes also aren't eating birds, but Colorado snakes again are primarily eating mammals. But then things start to change, right? We go a little bit more south and we go to Kansas and we see this tick of reptilian prey kick in there, right? So snakes are eating a little bit of reptilian prey. So we're now looking at a very different prey item. But if we move south to New Mexico, which is now toward our southern limit, this reptilian prey goes way up, right? And in fact, we're also seeing an amphibian prey item. So we're seeing this trend where as we move south, reptiles and amphibians in our case become a more common prey item and a more important prey item. So these might actually be having a greater, exerting a greater pressure on what is inside of a rattlesnake's venom. Now, when we go ahead and we bin those data differently, I talked about Denver, Colorado a little bit ago as being that split that we see in the venom phenotypes. That falls at 39 degrees roughly of latitude. And if we cut our data at that 39-degree parallel, we see above that 39-degree mark, we're looking at all mammalian prey, maybe a few birds in there, but all warm-blooded prey, right? Now, south of that 39-degree parallel, about a quarter of our diet is not mammalian prey. We're seeing a bunch of prey items that are reptilian, they're amphibian, there's some birds in there. So we're seeing a more diversified diet south of that Denver cutoff. So this is probably a major driver of venom variation. Now, when we think about how toxic a venom actually is, that's what's going to drive these patterns, right? So if we take that venom and we take that SVMP rich venom, that one that turns you into mush, and we challenge a bunch of mice and lizards with it, we find that it's equally toxic, right? So our southern venom is no better at doing mammals than it is at doing lizards, but our northern venom, our myotoxin rich venom, is actually way better at doing mammals than it is at doing lizards. So it looks like that northern venom actually gives a really strong advantage to eating mammals. So that's what we're seeing here in real time. We're seeing snakes in different areas having different diets, and those diets are actually influencing the toxins that are in their diet or that are in their venom. All right. So one last kind of line of data just to throw at this. What about climate, right? Some places are cold, some are hot. How does that actually predict these different venom phenotypes? So what we can do to kind of get an idea of this is we can take occurrence points for these prairie rattlesnakes, we can throw them on a map, and we can kind of correlate them to a bunch of different climatic factors. And in general, if we get a good fit to the known distribution of those prairie rattlesnakes, this will tell us that our venom concords pretty strongly with some different climatic variables, right? So in fact, we do see a pretty good match here. And what we see is that if we look at this in a climatic sense, our northern venom, right, our more paralytic venom, is pretty accurately predicted in space by these climatic variables. And in fact, the southern one is too. So we see that there is a pretty good relationship with climate, but we see that the climatic elements that are doing this are actually different between the two venoms. So our northern venom might be more constrained by things like the mean temperature during the driest quarter of the year, maybe things like the mean diurnal range or the annual mean temperature. So a lot of temperature and dryness, right? Whereas our southern venom is under different controls. So again, mean diurnal range, mean temperature, but then also things maybe like annual precipitation. So venoms are definitely environmentally related, but maybe the factors that are pushing for their distributions actually vary depending on what's in them. All right, so that's all I've got for venom stuff really quickly here. So just a quick take home, just trying to move this out of the way. Just a quick take home here, right? So I know I threw a lot at you there, but what we're seeing in the prairie rattlesnake are two spatially discrete venom phenotypes. We see a myotoxin A dominant northern phenotype, so it's that paralytic toxic phenotype, but then we also see an SVMP rich southern phenotype, right? So a little bit more kind of turn you into mush. I know I keep saying that. These venom phenotypes are under strong selection from various interacting biotic and abiotic forces. So think about prey items, climate, so on and so forth. But then the coolest little take home out of all of this is that myotoxin is actually a taxon specific, right, or a species specific toxin that works on mammals. And that makes it the first prey specific toxin ever identified from a rattlesnake. So in addition to having this really toxic venom, these rattlesnakes actually have one specific compound that is really, really good at taking down mammals. So that's probably the coolest finding that we've pulled out of this. All right. Now, the second half, I'm just going to kind of roll through it here, is predator-prey interactions, right? So we talked a lot about what venom phenotypes look like on the landscape, but now how do predator and prey actually feed into what you have in your venom? So this gets into my main research focus for quite a few years now, is this idea of can venom resistance dynamics in the food web actually influence that venom variation, right? So is what you eat responding to you, and then do you respond to what you eat, and vice versa? And we call this, in science, we call this Van Valen's Red Queen hypothesis. And it's the idea, that these reciprocally interacting organisms are co-evolving with one another in order to remain competitive. And this is just kind of a through the looking glass figure here. But it's this idea that you have to do a lot of running in evolutionary time just to stay in the same place with respect to everything going on around you. All right, so let's kind of roll back a little bit. So I talked about cow pasture in eastern Colorado, right? We think about that as a pretty boring landscape, but to a rattlesnake, this is actually quite complex, right? So maybe you're sitting in the middle of a field as a rattlesnake, and there's a bunch of stuff going on around you, right? So there's things that you potentially view as a snack. You might have a meadowlark singing on a cactus here. Maybe there's a lizard skittering around, and there might even be, a cotton rat digging up some seeds in the corner. So those are all things that you have to look for if you're trying to feed yourself. Now, conversely, there are going to be things on the landscape that want to eat you, right? So this king snake in the bottom corner might be using its tongue to kind of get a whiff of rattlesnakes. maybe this coyote gets, bumps into a rattlesnake and gets an easy meal. And then, of course, you have birds of prey that are flying overhead all the time looking for something they can grab. So this landscape is incredibly complex if you're a rattlesnake. And today we're going to delve into two of those topics, right? So the prey, so let's think about rodents today, and then the predators. So let's just hone in on birds of prey. So how do these two things, right? So being eaten by something or wanting to eat something, how do these actually influence what your venom looks like? Or conversely, how does it influence how these other creatures live their lives? All right, so we talked about SVMP. Again, just a quick refresher. So SVMP in eastern Colorado, in southeastern Colorado rather, is that main lethality inducing toxin, right? We see a lot of it in prairie rattlesnake venoms, and that's effectively what's going to kill things. So we can use that as a proxy to really gauge how toxic a venom is going to be to things. So today we're focusing on snake venom metalloprotease. I'm sure myotoxin is important in the northern part of the distribution, but this is all we're focusing in on today, just for simplicity. So we went ahead and we trapped a bunch of mice. So we caught 6 different species of native rodents. You guys might be familiar with some of these. So things like deer mice, Ord's kangaroo rats, a really cool creature called a grasshopper mouse. We had wood rats, we had little pocket mice, and then we had just house mice, feral house mice. And we trapped these rodents from wild communities in both northern and in southern Colorado. And we looked at that SVMP that I talked about, right? So in short, what we did is we took blood from these rodents, we mixed it with that rattlesnake venom, and we basically measured how powerful or how degradative that SVMP was, and conversely, how good of a job this rodent blood does at kind of turning that SVMP off. We also did some LD50s, which is where we just gauged general toxicity against these rodents. So how toxic is the venom to the rodent? And then on the flip side, we wanted to look at a predator, right? So we looked at 6 different species of birds of prey. So the red-tailed hawk, the Swainson's hawk, the golden eagle, the bald eagle, the prairie falcon, and the great horned owl. And for this, we just used blood. So we collected some blood from a bunch of different birds held at a raptor rehabilitation program. And we did that SVMP assay that I just talked about, where we took blood, we mixed it with venom, and we measured how powerful that SVMP was, and conversely, how well that bird could mitigate it. We also used domestic chicken just as a control for this. Chickens are kind of just a farmed animal. They really shouldn't have any rattlesnake venom resistance. So they make a very convenient control. All right, and here's what we see. So just a couple tidbits out of this. So prairie rattlesnake venom does appear to be locally adapted, right? So these rattlesnakes are better at eating prey items that they live with, right? So if we take a deer mouse from northern Colorado and a deer mouse from southern Colorado, and we challenge both of these mice with, let's say, southern Colorado prairie rattlesnake venom, we'll find the strongest match between the southern rattlesnake and the southern mouse. So our rattlesnakes are more toxic to mice that they co-occur with. We would expect that, right? We would hope that rattlesnakes are good at eating the food that's around them. So a pretty good kind of typical finding. But we also see some weird stuff come out of here. So some of these rodents possess really strong resistance mechanisms to rattlesnake venoms. So if we think about rattlesnake venoms on a lab mouse, something that shouldn't have any resistance, that northern rattlesnake venom, that toxic one, it's got an LD50 of about 1.25, which is just a number. Just think about that as a number. So a really low number, right? Our southern rattlesnake's number is a little bit higher, but 2.5. So it takes 1.25 or 2.5 micrograms of venom to kill 1 gram of mouse, basically, if we math that out, right? But if we look at these wild rodents, our northern grasshopper mouse doesn't take 1.25 or 2.5 micrograms. He takes 127 micrograms. So he is orders of magnitude higher in venom resistance than these captive lab mice are. And the same thing with our kangaroo rat, right? He doesn't take 1.25 or 2.5. He takes 125. So what we're seeing here is this just magnitude of difference in these wild rodents. They're actually really, really good at getting bitten by rattlesnakes and detoxifying that venom. So this might put really strong selection on prairie rattlesnakes to have a very toxic venom because they need a lot of it, right? All right, now our raptors. What are raptors doing? Now this is easy to explain. Raptors aren't doing anything. So birds of prey love eating rattlesnakes, but in fact, they do not appear to have any venom resistance. And what we see here is a whole bunch of squiggly lines. But the take home is that our domestic chicken, which should not be resistant, it doesn't interact with rattlesnakes, is actually no more able to neutralize these rattlesnake venom components than something like a red-tailed hawk or a golden eagle. So birds are eating snakes. They're eating them presumably very carefully. But if a hawk does get bitten by a snake, it's in big trouble. So rattlesnake venoms are very toxic against birds of prey. All right, so just to wrap up on that, so in conclusion, rattlesnake venoms are locally adapted for some prey animals, right? Meaning they're really good at killing some mice. But we also see the opposite, right? Several rodents in this system possess strong resistance to rattlesnake venoms, so they're locally adapted at being resistant. North American raptors, on the other hand, are entirely non-resistant. So they're just being careful, I suppose. And then finally, the take home is that this idea, this venom resistance landscape, it's complicated and it's ever changing. So we're viewing a snapshot of it, but there's a lot going on in natural systems, and it's important that we dig into them for that reason. All right, so with that, venoms are complicated, they're complex phenotypes, they're evolutionary labile, and they're shaped by a bunch of interacting pressures. And this integrative approach is really important to understanding how venoms vary and why they vary. So this is why science matters, right? We need to get to the bottom of stuff like this that occurs all around us every day. All right, so with that, I think I'm done yapping at you guys. I just want to acknowledge a couple of people that have really made this work move forward. So that's the Macassey and Casto labs. I want to thank all these private landowners who have been so accommodating with letting us come out and collect rattlesnakes and venoms. I'm really good at getting my car stuck, so I always have private landowners pulling my car out of ditches and sand areas of sandy fields and stuff like that. So I appreciate that. And then really just a mountain of people. So field herpers, snake keepers, generally just naturalists, whatever. There's a mountain of people who have been really, really helpful in helping us out with this work. And then finally, all of these different sources of funding and collaborators that have been really kind in throwing some money at us and allowing us to produce this really, really exciting data. So thanks to all of these different groups. All right. And with that, I know that was a lot to take in, but I'll be happy to answer any questions. I've also got some props that I kind of promised last year that I would bring along. So I've got snakes. These are dead snakes. So these are snakes from a museum that are in a jar. But then I did you one better. And I decided to go ahead and bring in a live snake. So the snake that I've got here is an Eastern indigo snake. See if we can get him up by the camera there. He's going to kiss the camera. But we're totally able to just do snake show and tell as well if you've got any questions about snakes or about science or about really anything else. So with that, I'll stop talking and I'll give the floor over to you guys.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much. We got a lot of questions for you. Let's go back to the top. So General, someone said, how many teeth do snakes have?
Oh my gosh, that's a great question. I don't know. So the answer that I'll give you is a lot. So if let's see if we can get this guy to look at the camera. So if we can get a little snake cam here. So they have a mouth obviously that's full of these little teeth, and these teeth are sharp. They're small and they're sharp and they're pointy, and they'll drop out pretty readily too, right? So you can think about a snake grabbing something like maybe a frog. That frog will thrash around, and those teeth will actually break off from time to time, right? So there's a whole lot of teeth in there. The teeth grow back, which makes them really, really interesting. So unlike people, right, we have these baby teeth, they drop out, you get adult teeth. And then if you get a cavity in your adult teeth, you're doomed, right? You have to live with that cavity forever. A snake doesn't work that way. If it gets a cavity or a tooth breaks out, it'll just grow that tooth right back. So teeth are not a limiting factor for snakes. I know I didn't answer your question. That was my way to avoid it. I don't know how many teeth snakes have, but they have a lot, is my answer.
Okay, thank you for that one. The next question would be, how long do snakes live?
That's a great question. So it's super, super variable. And for a lot of species, we don't actually know. So in general, smaller snakes, maybe a garter snake, we might expect that to live in the wild, maybe just a couple of years, right? You have to think about all the things trying to eat it. The snake could get hit by a car. It's probably not going to live a long life in the wild. But in captivity, a garter snake could live 10, 15 years. We have some data from things like rattlesnakes and pythons where we see lifespans, right around 40 or even 50 years, quite probably even longer for some species. So in short, snakes can live a long time, but the life of a wild snake is tough. They have a lot to kind of contend with. So they typically don't live too long.
Interesting. Our next one, kind of funny. Are snakes friends?
Are snakes friends? That's an awesome question. So if you asked people this question maybe 20 years ago, you'd get laughed at and people would say, oh, they have a, kind of a dumb little reptilian brain. There's not much going on in there. Well, it turns out that's not the case. Snakes actually have a ton going on in their head. And there's been a whole lot of work lately done on rattlesnakes, especially, and we see that snakes are friends, right? So they have friends, for lack of better terms. They stay in these dens, they stay with other snakes that they recognize, and they even have maternal care. So what we're seeing now in a lot of these rattlesnakes is that a mom will give birth and she'll actually stay with her young. She knows who her babies are, she'll protect them, she'll guard them. That of course doesn't last forever, right? But snakes do have maternal care. So there's a lot more going on in the snake brain than I think we've traditionally appreciated.
Yeah. All right, so the next question would be, um, Felipe would like to know how long snakes can grow.
Oh, that's a good question, Felipe. So the longest snake that we know of that occurs in this planet today is a snake called the reticulated python. So it's a big, big, big python. It comes from Southeast Asia. And I don't know if we have a perfect estimate on how big these things can get. The number that floats around a lot is 33 feet. So we think the largest ever reticulated python was somewhere around 33 feet. It was probably a little bit smaller because people aren't great at measuring things, but probably somewhere around 30 feet. We also know the heaviest snake in the world is the green anaconda. So while the green anaconda doesn't get as long as a reticulated python, it will get way heavier, and they tend to eat some really, really big things like capybaras and caiman and things like that. So there's some big snakes out there.
Wow. Interesting. Christian wonders if you have ever been bitten by a snake, and if so, what kind?
Well, okay, so there's two answers to this question. So I've never been bitten by a venomous snake, and I intend to keep it that way. So I just, spent 20 minutes rambling about snake venom. I hope everybody realizes how bad it would be to have that inside of you. That would not be a fun time. It would be very expensive. Be safe, right? Always be safe when you're dealing with a venomous snake. With that said, I get bitten all the time by snakes. They're always harmless snakes like this. But when you go out and look for snakes and they need to protect themselves, they don't have any hands, they can't really make a whole lot of noise. A lot of the time, their kind of quick knee-jerk reaction is just to give you a quick nip, right? And that's their way of telling you, hey, leave me alone, please don't eat me. Of course, that's always harmless if it's a non-venomous snake. You barely even feel it most of the time. But snakes will bite you. It is their only way to defend themselves. They don't want to have to do it, but we get bitten all the time when we study snakes. It's just part of the job.
Let's see. So our next question would be, how is it safe to consume snakes considering the venom?
It's a good question. So, it is safe to consume snakes. I've actually eaten snake. It's pretty good. I would recommend it. But so the venom is an interesting deal, right? So venoms are proteins. And when we think about proteins, proteins are very easy to denature, right? So venom is a protein in the same way hamburger is a protein, right? Ground beef is probably not good to eat raw, but if we throw it on, let's say, a frying pan and cook it, we're going to denature that protein and make it safe to eat. Snake venom is technically the same way. So if we eat snake venom, we can actually denature it by, let's say cooking it or heating it up. But then our stomach acid will also denature it. So snake venom is technically something you could eat. I don't recommend it, but you could eat it and be okay. Now, on the flip side, the actual meat of the snake, right? So if we're thinking about, let's say these tasty backstraps here on our indigo snake, there's no venom in this, right? If this were a venomous snake, all the venom is going to be in two big glands in the head of that snake. So in theory, if you were wanting to eat a rattlesnake, you could just not eat the head and you would be totally fine. But that's why you can technically eat snake venom.
Interesting. Someone asks, is there a limit to how much venom a snake can release?
It's a great question. So there is not technically a limit. So in theory, if you're a snake, you could go ahead and just dump your whole supply of venom into something. With that said, there's been a ton of work on this topic called venom metering, right? So venom is time consuming to produce. It takes a while to build back up. And if you're a snake, you don't want to kind of blow your whole shot of venom on one thing because you might need more venom 20 minutes down the road, right? So most snakes that are venomous actually meter their venom. They're going to make a decision on how much venom to put out per bite. And typically what that means is that they're never going to use up all their venom in one shot.
All right, so our next question, I just learned what a snake charmer was. So the question would be, are snake charmers real or just a myth?
Oh, all right. So snake charmers are real in the sense that they exist, right? But snake charming isn't real. So snake charming is this whole hoax that people have made up, and a lot of people buy into it and they think it's real. So the classic snake that a snake charmer will use is generally something like a cobra. And the reason they do that, right, is a cobra is what we would call visually oriented. So it's a snake that watches everything. It's going to throw up a hood like that. It's going to watch you. And if I'm here holding a flute and I'm playing a tune, that snake is going to watch the flute. And because it's a snake, it's going to do that, right? So you all of a sudden look like you're charming this snake. You're not charming the snake. The snake doesn't have external ears. It can't hear you. I mean, it can feel some vibrations. But what it sees is it sees a big hairy monkey holding a flute and rocking back and forth. And because it's afraid, right, it's going to rock back and forth with the snake charmer. So snake charming is real. There are people in the world who do it, but the actual act of like, oh, this snake is listening to the music and it's dancing, none of that is happening. That's not real.
Wow. Okay, cool. Um, really quickly, someone said their connection stopped for a minute. What kind of snake are you holding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So his name is Shredder. So I didn't name him, a friend named him. Shredder is an Eastern indigo snake. So if you guys don't know much about Eastern indigo snakes, I'd encourage you to just give it a quick Google. They're super cool. But Shredder's actually a baby, so he's only a year old. He'll get maybe 6 feet, maybe 8 feet at most. These things get huge, right? These are a big snake, but they're really special as an American animal because we only have them here in the US. So these live in an area called the coastal plain. You can find them in Florida, Georgia, potentially the Carolinas in the past, but they live in a really threatened habitat called longleaf pine savanna. And the reason they're in so much trouble is because most of that habitat has been destroyed. It's been logged, it's been taken away, and there's other animals that live there that are also doing really poorly, like the gopher tortoise, the eastern diamondback rattlesnake. So this is a really important conservation priority for American conservationists. So it's exciting to be able to share that with you guys today. And another reason I think that these indigo snakes are really, really cool that people don't often know about is they're one of the few snakes in the world that can eat venomous snakes. So this is a harmless snake, like I told you. I wouldn't be holding it like this if it was venomous. But Shredder is actually immune to the venom of North American vipers. So if I put Shredder in a box with, let's say, a diamondback rattlesnake, he would eat that diamondback rattlesnake. He wouldn't think twice about it. And that diamondback might try to bite him, but in fact, that venom would do nothing. Uh, because this indigo snake is very resistant to rattlesnake venom. So indigos are one of the few snakes, or actually one of several snakes, but one of the few in the US that eats snakes as a really, really big chunk of their diet. So for that reason, they're probably good to keep around if you don't want to have rattlesnakes on your property.
So our next question would be, what should I do if I would get bitten by a venomous snake?
That's a great question. So number one is don't panic. So people love to panic. I know tons of people around me all the time who panic. Just don't panic. So you're going to be okay. Snake bite doesn't really kill people in the US, right? It's just a medical thing. It's a medical issue. We know how to deal with it here. So if you get bitten by a rattlesnake, the first thing to do is don't kill the rattlesnake. People always try to grab a shovel and kill the rattlesnake and then try to take it to the hospital. You don't need to do that. If you're bitten by a rattlesnake, just go to the hospital. Go to the hospital, tell them you were bitten by a rattlesnake. It'll be fine. They'll give you antivenom. You'll be okay. You have nothing to worry about, right? But do take it seriously. Don't sit at home. Don't try to sleep it off. Go get medical help, right? But step one is don't get bitten by a rattlesnake. And that's easy to do generally. People do legitimately get bitten if they're hiking or they put their hands somewhere they can't see. That does happen. But the vast majority of snake bites occur because people make them happen. So it's generally when someone's showing off and they try to pick up a snake or grab a snake, or they're trying to kill a snake, right? That's on their property. So if you just leave snakes alone, they'll leave you alone. They don't want to bite you either. It's kind of the take home I'm trying to make. So yeah.
Good advice.
Yeah.
Someone also asked, what is the coldest area you can find snakes in? Maybe
Oh,
like
great
regions
question.
things?
Yeah. So you can find snakes everywhere. So well, not everywhere. They're not in Antarctica. They're not in the, far north where the polar bears are, but they're pretty much everywhere. So I grew up in a place it was so cold. So I grew up in Winnipeg. We would get -40 in the winter. We'd have snow for 7 months of the year, and we had thriving snake populations. There are snakes that make it up into the Arctic Circle. So this is actually a viper, the European adder. That thing makes it all the way up into the Arctic Circle. It's only active for a few months of the year, but it does really well up there. And then there's stuff that's really, really high elevation. So we see Asian pit vipers that are, up in the Himalayas at really, really high elevations where it's cold. So snakes do manage to persist in these cold environments. They're certainly not common and they're not, very diverse snake communities up there. But even in cold weather, yeah, you can have snakes that, manage to eke out a living.
Someone said, Yashil wonders if you wanted to study snakes when you were little and what inspired you.
I did. Yeah. So I've always been a weird kid, and I think a lot of us as scientists can probably relate to this, right? So your friends are out there playing soccer or doing whatever they're doing, and then you're catching bugs, right? So I grew up as that kid for sure. And I think for me, it's always just been reptiles. I mean, these are such cool creatures, right? People are, conventionally pretty afraid of them. They don't understand them. But when you kind of get past this, idea of, oh, it's a scary snake, there's so much left to kind of learn about these animals, right? How do they do what they do? Why do they do it? Yeah, I mean, I think I would encourage anyone, for any animal to just kind of dig a little bit more deeply and try to understand how it does what it does and why it does that. And I think there's so much left to learn out there. And snakes are one example of that.
Awesome. Is there a species of snake you would recommend as a pet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think if, you just want to hop into the snake world and try keeping one as a pet, I think some of the easiest things that you can kind of get your hands on and really enjoy are snakes like corn snakes and king snakes. If you want something bigger, maybe something like a bull snake or a gopher snake. But these are all snakes that live here in North America, right? So people breed them, they come in a bunch of different colors. But the nice thing about them is that they're native snakes, right? So they're very hardy. They can put up with cold weather, they can put up with maybe your humidity or your temperature is a little bit off, and they're going to be very forgiving. So people sometimes make this mistake of going in and getting, let's say, a green tree python or some weird exotic, beautiful snake in its own right. But a lot of the times when you get an exotic snake, it has very exotic needs, right? So if it gets too cold or it gets too dry, or you look at it the wrong way, or you poke it in the wrong spot or something like that, you can really set yourself up for failure. So if you want to get a snake and you want to really enjoy it, I would totally recommend just getting something like a corn snake or a king snake right off the bat.
All right, that's really interesting. So someone said, "Hi Neil, it's Mizanur from Bangladesh. Thanks for your nice presentation. I have a question based on your presentation. If we offer same food and environment for captive snakes, then venom will be different or same. Consider that snakes has been collected from different ecological zones."
Oh my gosh, this is a hardcore question. Okay, hi, Ms. Honor, thank you so much. Yes, that's a great question. So yeah, so the way I would kind of frame this, we're essentially talking about a common garden experiment, right? So you can think about, like, just more generally for everybody, you can think about pea plants, right? So there's been a bunch of experiments where people have taken pea plants and grown them in the same garden, and we can see how many traits are actually genetically encoded or how many come from the environment around them, right? Now, snake venoms work the same way. Unfortunately, there's a ton of data on this. So many people have thought, maybe snake venoms are under control from things around them, right? So if I'm a baby snake and I grow up eating frogs versus my brother who grows up eating mice, are our venoms going to look different, right? Is my brother who eats mice going to have a more mousy venom, and am I who eat frogs going to have a more froggy venom? Well, it turns out that by and large, this is not the case. So there's been a ton of work where people have collected snakes and they've brought them into a lab and they've kind of assessed that venom every year for, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years. And that venom, it maybe changes a little bit. And these are things that are probably age related or just random in nature. But no, we don't actually see strong evidence suggesting that captivity or varied diets or anything like that are impacting the individual level of variation. We do certainly see changes in venom over kind of, the lifespan of an animal ontogenetically. So in the prairie rattlesnakes that we talked about just a moment ago, a baby prairie rattlesnake tends to have a very toxic venom. And as it gets bigger and older, that toxicity will decline in favor of more degradative components, right? So the venom does change, potentially related to age-related things. But no, in short, there's really not a whole lot of evidence indicating that removal of a snake from the wild or different feeding regimes will change venom in a way that matters, at least from a biological standpoint. So hopefully that answered that question.
Yeah, great detail. Thank you. What part of the US has the most diversity in snake types?
It's a great question. So the most diversity, well, so there's what I will say, there's two regions of the US that have these really beautiful diversities. And I'll just go ahead and make a plug real quick here. This is why we need things like national parks, right? And we need to be supporting all these federal agencies who do this great kind of boots on the ground work, right? Because the US, people forget about all the time, is actually a really, really special place. And it's a cradle of some really amazing reptile and amphibian diversity. So the two really big hotspots that we see for reptiles in the US, one actually falls in the southeast, so right where Shredder comes from, and this is kind of the coastal plain region. So parts of Florida, parts of Georgia, the Carolinas, the Gulf Coast. This is a really, really unique ecosystem that has a ton of endemic reptiles that occur nowhere else in the world, right? So the eastern diamondback is one of them, that really big rattlesnake. The eastern indigo is one of them, the gopher tortoise. These are all animals that are uniquely American, and we should be proud of, right, as Americans, to have these animals here and only here. So we need to conserve that landscape. The other area, and this is an area that really feels like home to me, is the desert Southwest, right? So Arizona, Texas, New Mexico, Southern California. These deserts are kind of the US, at least, cradle of rattlesnake diversity. And we see some brilliant diversification of rattlesnakes occurring there. And in some areas, you can have 10 or maybe even 12 species within a stone's throw of one another. So certainly the southwestern US is a really interesting place for snake diversity, but then also that southeast kind of coastal plain region. Those are the two hotspots.
All right, so our next question is, what is the most dangerous snake you have handled?
Oh, so most dangerous is it's a tough thing to say, right? Because any snake can be dangerous depending on the context. I would say my work right now is pretty much 50-50 split between rattlesnakes here in the US. And then during the summer, I take off to Asia and I work on cobras. And then in Asia, we also interact with things like kraits, which are a really venomous elapid. We have vipers like the Russell's viper. So all of these snakes are dangerous, I would say, if you were to be bitten by them. You certainly don't want to be bitten by a cobra or a rattlesnake. But the point that I'll stress is just that snakes don't want to bite you, right? They don't want to put you in danger. So it's our responsibility as researchers and just as people generally to be as safe as we can be, right? So we handle, a lot of cobras and a lot of rattlesnakes. We do it safely. We don't ever put hands on something like a rattlesnake or a cobra unless we're doing it for a reason. So with that in mind, I guess I'll say the most dangerous snake is one that you're kind of irresponsible with handling. That would be my answer to that.
Chase would like to know, what is the strength of a snake bite?
Oh, another really great question. So that's all over the map, right? So there's things like, I'm trying to think about what you guys have in Iowa. Do you have like ringneck? You have garter snakes, right? So getting bitten by a garter snake, you probably wouldn't feel that really at all, right? Kind of feels like a piece of Velcro brushing on you typically. So that would be like a weak snake bite. But then some of the strongest bites, it's kind of funny. This would actually be a snake that might deliver one of the strongest bites pound for pound, right? Or you could think of something like a king cobra with really, really big kind of cranial musculature, muscles in the head. So snakes like this, or snakes like the king cobra, have a bite that's made for crushing, and that's not something we think about in snakes. But an indigo snake does not wrap around its prey. It doesn't have any venom. So the only way it can kill its prey is brutal. It's by crushing that prey with its jaws. So if I'm a rattlesnake and I slither by this indigo snake will kill me by crushing me. It's going to grab me by the head or the neck, and it's just going to bite and chew. And you can actually hear things like bones popping when an indigo snake is eating another snake. It's just brutal. But I think it demonstrates how strong a bite from one of these snakes can really be. So I guess in short, don't put your hands into the mouth of an indigo snake if you don't want to find out. But pound for pound, yeah, something like an indigo snake or maybe a big cobra, maybe a king cobra, could deliver a very, very strong bite.
So the next question would be, do snakes get stressed out when they can't slither?
That's a good question. So in general, no, I think is how I would answer that. So snakes actually don't, I mean, we see snakes slithering around a lot. They look happy. Snakes want to hide, right? And if you're a wild snake, the only time you're really safe is when you're curled up really, really tight and you're maybe in a hole in the ground or under a log or something like that, right? So a snake is probably happiest when it's safe. And when it's safe, it's curled up in a little ball in a really, really tight space where nothing is going to hurt it. So when we have a pet snake or a captive snake or a snake that's really used to people, it's probably at ease, slithering around between your hands. It certainly isn't concerned of being eaten, right? We see no stress in a snake like this right now. This guy obviously knows we're not going to hurt him. But for a wild snake, yeah, if I were a wild snake, I would want to be curled up really, really tight in a safe, dark spot.
Amir would like to know which species of snakes are endangered.
Yeah, that's a great question. So lots of them is kind of the short answer there. So in the US, it tends to be things that come from really threatened areas. So things like this indigo snake. There's other snakes that live in this area. So eastern diamondback rattlesnakes, pine snakes, gopher tortoises, of course, aren't a snake, but they're another creature in this habitat. And these are all things in the US that are at risk. I talked a little bit about our rattlesnake diversity in the Southwest. We see the same kind of trend there. So there's rattlesnakes like the twin-spotted rattlesnake, the Massasaugas, the I'm blanking on the common name here, the ridge-nosed rattlesnake, Crotalus willardi. These are all really, really pretty, tiny little rattlesnakes that live in this really special habitat that's in trouble. So this tends to be the type of snake that's endangered in the US at least. Stuff that has habitat that's really, gone downhill over the last few years.
So our next question is, how does a snake generate its venom?
Ooh, really good question. So venom is really nothing more than a modified saliva, right? So you can think about your own saliva. So you as a human have a bunch of these little bumps in your mouth, these little salivary glands, and you don't even think about it, right? They just generate saliva all the time. Sometimes when you're talking too quick and your tongue hits that thing on the bottom of your mouth and your spit goes flying out, I think they call that like gleeking or something like that. But we don't think about any of that, right? That's just passive. We just do it. And a snake is the same way, right? So these salivary glands in a snake, a couple of them have actually evolved or changed over evolutionary time, and they've been co-opted to make venoms. So venoms are just modified salivas. All of the, or many of the proteins at least, are very similar to proteins in other salivas, but they've been modified, right, to do what a snake needs them to do. So snakes are just making it all the time, right? They can run out of it if they use it all in one shot, let's say, but it will just keep coming back. It will keep accumulating. So they just make it. Yeah.
Another venom question. Does snake venom capacity depend on size?
Totally. Yeah, that's a great question. So there's an old wives' tale that people talk about a lot, right? Oh, a baby snake is more dangerous than an adult. It doesn't know how to give its venom or something along those lines, right? So that's not true. And that's not true for a couple of reasons. And one of those big reasons is that a baby snake doesn't have nearly as much venom as an adult snake, right? So when we think about a snake having venom glands in its head, you can see a baby snake like Shredder here has a small head, right? He's only going to have tiny venom glands. But as he gets big and his head gets, as big as my fist, the venom glands are also going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. So a baby snake just straight up does not have the venom capacity that an adult snake has. And for that reason, it would be impossible for a baby snake to deliver the same amount of venom as an adult.
So the next question is, how do you tell the difference between male and female snakes?
Oh, great question. So it's hard. And I guess the answer is you have to know what you're looking for. So snakes keep their parts, we'll say, in their tail, right? They're totally internal. And what we can do in a mature snake is we can generally actually look at the tail and just tell from the shape, right? So a female snake doesn't have much kind of stashed up in there. So her tail is going to be skinny. It's going to taper real quick. But a male snake has a paired sexual organ. So it's called a hemipene or hemipenes. He's got two of them, right? So we actually see these two tracks in the tail here. It's kind of hard to see on this snake, but you'll see basically two bulges and it'll look like a really fat tail. And that's just a male snake. All of his sexual organs are stashed in his tail. So there's a couple other things you can use, but in general, if you know what you're looking for, you can just look at a snake's tail. And this guy's holding it up in the air for us. Should probably put that down, buddy. But anyway, yeah, you can check the tail generally.
Cool. Someone asked, do snakes eat other snakes' eggs?
Yeah. So snakes eat everything. And when I say everything, they eat everything made of meat in general. So there are snakes out there that are, specialized to eat insects. There are snakes that eat crabs. So at the end of the day, if it's made out of meat or something like meat, there's probably a snake that's evolved to eat it or does eat it. So from the egg front, I would say probably most snakes will eat an egg if they run across it, right? So a rattlesnake or a corn snake or a bull snake, if it's cruising and it finds a nest, that's a free omelet. It's going to eat that, right? For sure it's going to eat that. But then we take it a step further, and there's actually two groups of snakes called the egg-eating snakes. One occurs in India, the other group is all over Africa. And these are snakes that are made to eat only eggs. Their teeth have really kind of devolved. They've turned into like these little sandpaper-like projections, and they stretch. They're really, really stretchy. They look like they sucked in a golf ball. But these are snakes that for half the year only eat eggs. And they go from nest to nest. They suck up these eggs, they eat the eggs, and then they'll throw up the shell. And then for the remaining half of the year, when birds are not nesting, they just don't eat. So talk about an extreme diet, right? An egg only diet. There are snakes out there that do that.
It says Caleb would like to know if snakes have emotions.
That's a great question, and I don't know if I have a good answer to that. So I don't work on that myself. Like I talked about a little bit earlier, there's this whole school of work now being done where people are really looking at these complex social behaviors, right? Or these social lives of snakes. So we do know that there's a lot more going on in the snake brain than previously appreciated. This isn't a robot, right? It doesn't just cruise on autopilot all day. There is a lot going on here as far as kin recognition and how it makes decisions. Whether snakes have emotions, they certainly don't have emotions that I would say compare to human emotions. But I think the jury is maybe still out on that, and that's something that people are working on and should be working on. Yeah.
Someone asked, is there a difference between male and female snakes with their venom?
Not really. So that's a really good question. So in general, not really. So venoms are pretty consistent across sexes. I'm trying to think. There has been some work that's looked at that and has actually found minor differences in venom. And I'm trying to think about a scenario where this might happen, right? So if you're a snake that's what we would call sexually dimorphic, let's say, so a male is maybe really, really small in adulthood, and a female is much larger, you might be in a scenario where you're eating different things, right? So that you're not competing with your other half, for lack of better terms. And in this situation, we might see cases where maybe a male snake, which is smaller, is eating only frogs, let's say, whereas the bigger female is eating things like rats or birds. That might actually be a scenario where we could see a sexual difference in venom. And there's maybe a little bit of data that does find this here and there. I'm just struggling to think of stuff off the top of my head. But by and large, for most snakes, there does not appear to be any evidence of sexual differences in venom.
All right, so our next question is, what is your opinion on owning a snake and how do you give them a proper enclosure?
I think you guys know my opinion. So I think snakes are great pets, right? And I don't know if my mom's in here. I know she was going to tune in. I was that kid growing up who had a bunch of snakes. It probably, really bothered my parents at some level. But no, snakes are wonderful pets, right? So they generally only eat once a week, once every 2 weeks, maybe even once a month, depending on what kind of snake. So they're very easy to look after. You just keep them fed, keep them watered, pull them out and play with them whenever you feel like it. They generally don't care either way. They're, I think, a perfect pet in a lot of ways. The only thing that maybe requires a little bit more attention than, I don't know, let's say a hamster or a dog, is that they are cold-blooded animals, right? So they have some pretty specific, at times, climatic needs. So that means maybe you need to keep an eye on your temperature, right? You're probably going to need some way to heat the snake up. Maybe humidity might be a concern depending on the type of snake. So you have to be a little bit detail-oriented in some aspects. But I think in other aspects where really a lot of effort goes into owning a pet, snakes are perfect. You can really just kind of leave them on autopilot a lot of the time, provided you do meet kind of that bare minimum that they require. So really great pet.
A similar question to how you answered the last one. Do your parents like you working with snakes?
Yeah, I wish my mom could like get a mic and talk right now. No, so I think they do. So yeah, so I'm sure there was some trepidation at the beginning, right? Where they're like, "Oh, this is a weird career path." And in fact, I know my grandpa, he always used to be like, "Oh, you should be a doctor, blah blah blah." But I think I've always been really fortunate in that my parents have always supported me. And whether that was, having a million snakes in the house or wanting to go to grad school at a program, that worked on snake venoms, they've always had my back. And I would hope that other people would have kind of that similar relationship with their parents. So I would absolutely, always really be thankful for that. I think that's always been a really important thing that I could lean on. So certainly, I think they're happy, I guess, in short, to answer that question.
I think you had said like you're not sure if your mom is watching, but I'm not sure if you're looking at the chat, but she said she was watching. I believe that's her.
Oh, that's
But
pretty
the
funny. Yeah, yeah.
question is that how does the other layer of the snake skin form when they are shedding?
Yeah, that's a great question. So snakes shed their skin. I think everybody knows that. And it comes off in one big piece, right? It almost looks like a sock if you were to take a sock off upside down. So you can think a little bit about kind of like how when we form a scab, right? So the outer layer of the skin, the epidermis, is kind of like the outer layer of our skin, right? So what's going to happen is that when the snake gets big, it's going to undergo this kind of physiological process, and its body will tell it to shed. And that very, very outer layer of skin is going to detach. It's going to come off, and it's going to slip right off just like a sock, and there'll be new skin underneath.
Okay, sorry, we had to switch rooms
No,
because
it's all
we're
good.
starting the new one.
No worries.
But if you're comfortable like continuing questions, we have a lot more questions for you
Sure,
from
yeah, I
people.
don't mind hanging around for a little bit. Yeah.
So someone asked, how have snakes evolved over time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So snakes, how have they evolved over time? Well, they're certainly legless, right? This guy's in a knot right now. But snakes actually just represent a group of lizards. So when we think about all of the different lizards in the world, right? So iguanas, monitor lizards, geckos, snakes are not a separate group, right? So people think about snakes and then lizards as two very different things. Snakes are actually technically a type of lizard. And what's happened is that due to this really, really long time of unique pressures that snakes have faced, they've evolved to become legless, right? So they've lost their legs. And then with that, they've really, really diversified and radiated, right? So now we're released from this idea of a four-legged critter, that walks around. Now we're just a tube of muscle and bone that can move more freely. So from there, snakes can be arboreal. We see snakes that are really adapted to live up in the trees. We have snakes in the water. We have snakes in the ocean, right? We have sea snakes. So this new form, right, this legless form has really allowed snakes to kind of just go wild and fill all these new spaces that lizards wouldn't really fill easily.
All right, so our next question is, what is the longest living snake?
Yeah, so I think we got this a minute ago. So it's called the reticulated python. And I kind of spoke a little bit about length. We think the biggest one ever was probably somewhere around 33 feet, although it was probably shorter than that. And then the heaviest snake is a snake called the green anaconda. So quite a bit shorter in length, but a lot girthier and bigger bodied than a reticulated python.
Someone else also asked, how many muscles do they have so that they can lift up like a hooded viper?
Oh gosh. So I'm not a muscle person, an anatomist. So the answer is a lot. I have no idea. That's a really good question, and hopefully somebody more qualified will eventually answer that. But yeah, snakes are full of muscle. They're really just a big cord of muscle.
I'm not sure if you've answered this one before, but someone asked, Yashil would like to know what your favorite snake is.
Oh gosh, I hate this question because I never have a good answer. I go back and forth on this all the time. I love cobras. I love rattlesnakes. This is going to make a couple of people angry, so I'll just say it. I think my favorite rattlesnake is this thing called a prairie rattlesnake. It's the one we just talked about. It's kind of an ugly snake, but it's endearing to me. It's a snake that I kind of grew up wanting to see. I did a lot of my early work on it, and I think it's just a really nice snake. It always feels like home whenever you're somewhere where prairie rattlesnakes can be found. So love me a prairie rattlesnake for sure.
Navia would like to know what kinds of animals eat snakes.
All kinds of animals. That's a great question. So yeah, so I mean, if you're a snake, let's say in North America, some really big predators are going to be mammals and then birds, right? So birds of prey are going to be a big thing, but then also corvids, so crows, ravens, magpies, they love to eat snakes. And then mammals, skunks, raccoons, possums, foxes. So if you're a snake, you're pretty much on the menu for everybody, unfortunately.
All right, so the next question is venom used as a medicine in cultures and how?
It's a great question. So yeah, so in cultures, definitely. I don't have an example right off the hop, but certainly venoms and toxins are used culturally as medicines. More, I think, interesting from a scientific angle is that a lot of the medications that we use today, so for things like blood pressure or anti-cancer therapy, these are actually derived from snake venoms. So there's trying to think of an example. So there's a product called contortrostatin, and I believe this is a breast cancer medication. I'm just trying to scratch my head here. So yeah, breast cancer medication called contortrostatin, and it's made from venom of the copperhead. And what we find is that there's actually a toxin in this copperhead venom that didn't evolve for this purpose, But if we make, if we put it with cancer cells, it'll actually kill cancer cells preferentially. So that's another really important reason we need to keep snakes around, right? There are all these different toxins in their venoms that have evolved for these weird functions that help them in the world, but can also potentially help us. So if we kill snakes, we're actually only hurting our own ability to make stuff like this.
Someone said, what is the nicest snake that also looks scary and intimidating?
Oh man, that's a weird question. The nicest snake that also looks scary and intimidating. There's a lot of those. I would probably say like something really big, like a python or an anaconda. Um, yeah, anacondas especially, they have like, they look scary and they're big, and we see that movie where they eat J-Lo and stuff like that, and like everybody's afraid of anacondas. But if you actually pick one up, and I wish I would have brought one today, if you pick one up and look at its face, they've got such a stupid face. And I don't think people ever realize that because they're so busy being afraid. But their eyes are on the top of their head, right? They're a water snake, so they have eyes on the top of their head, and they have this stupid little nose on the top of their head, and they really just look like, I don't even know what they look like. They look like a puppy or something. They're just like, they have this dumb, really, really dumb little face that I think is impossible to be afraid of. But we're so busy romanticizing this idea of the anaconda being a man eater that we forget to just look at it and realize that, oh, it's kind of cute, you know? So yeah, that's what I would say. I would say an anaconda.
The next question is, will a snake's venom affect itself if digested or injected in itself?
That's an awesome question. So snakes bite themselves all the time, right? So imagine you're a snake and you have these two huge fangs in your mouth and you have to use them in really high pressure situations sometimes, right? Snakes bite themselves all the time. We see snakes bite their bottom jaw, they'll bite their body. They're not always, making the best decisions when they're working under pressure. So because of that, snakes tend to be resistant to their own venom. So certainly if you're a snake and you bite yourself, nothing's going to go wrong. You'll be okay. But then that also extends to your neighbors, right? So if you're a rattlesnake and you're bitten by your neighbor by accident, you'll be okay as well. So you should be fine.
The next question is, for snake wranglers, how do they avoid getting bitten when handling snakes?
Yeah, so I wish I had more stuff here to show you guys. So we actually use a tool called a hook, a snake hook, and I'm sure you've all seen this. It's a metal stick with a loop at the end. And this is just a tool that we can use. It's kind of like an extension of our arm, right? We can use that safely to move a snake around or pick up a snake without physically putting hands on it. And I would say that's the bulk of what I use in my work when I'm dealing with snakes, whether that's here or in Asia. Yeah, just don't put your hands on a snake, and there's no reason you have to be bitten by a snake. It's really that simple.
Yeah, so we have two more questions,
All right.
and one of them would be, do you have your own snakes at home?
Absolutely. So this is one of them, right? Shredder is one of them. I never really grew out of that phase of keeping snakes at home, unfortunately, probably. But I do. Yeah, I keep a few snakes around. I think as a snake scientist, I think there's so much to be gained from having a snake in the house, right? There's so many weird, quirky little things that a snake will show you if you keep it happy and healthy in your home that you would never be able to understand if you were looking for it in the field, right? So for that reason, I'll always keep snakes. And then I just like them. I mean, I think they're cool creatures. They're very easy to keep around. And I think as far as a pet goes, you could not have an easier or a better pet. So very pro snake.
The final one, maybe you've answered, but it is, what is the deadliest snake?
In the world. Okay, so drop for drop, the deadliest snake in the world, it's an Australian snake. It's called the inland taipan. Um, it's very deadly, I guess is all I'll say. But the kicker here is that the snake doesn't kill anyone. It hasn't, I don't think there's a single fatality on record. And the reason for that is it occurs way out in the outback where there's no people. So the snake has this horribly toxic venom, and it's made to kill rats really, really quickly, and it also kills people really, really quickly. But because snakes don't chase people, and because it lives in such a remote area, it doesn't kill people. So.
All right, so I think that's all the questions. It doesn't seem like we have any more. So thank you so much for presenting. It was really interesting,
Yeah.
and thank you to Shredder too for
Yeah.
coming along.
Thank you back. See if we can
Oh,
get
he's so cute. But yeah, I think that sums it up.
Yeah, and thanks to everybody who participated and asked questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, guys. It was great being here today. I always love coming to NBTI, and yeah, go look at some snakes when you have a second. Go enjoy them. So
Yeah. Yeah, nice to meet you too.
Cool. Yeah.